After Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities, and Ukraine's spectacular drone attack on some of Russia's most sophisticated warplanes deep inside Russia. Peace talks between the two adversaries continue, but they're getting nowhere. President Putin is gearing up for a massive summer offensive. President Trump is mulling over walking away after the failure of his peace process. And Ukraine is wondering how to continue the fight if there are no more US arms supplies. What happens next? Let's speak to Tim Marshall, world affairs analyst, author of many books, including Prisoners of Geography. Tim, let me start with this. Isn't the blunt truth that the peace process is over, that Mr. Putin's about to launch a huge summer offensive, and he's doing so because he still thinks he can win this war?
I'll agree with two of those three things, Andrew. I don't think the peace process is necessarily over.
Well, that's good news.
I think both sides actually want out. It's just that the Russian version of ending this is to demand basically surrender. And they presented terms in Istanbul yesterday which weren't serious. They were a surrender document. I think if they could get a lot more than at the moment they would get, they would be more serious than they are being. But you're right about the other two. There's a big offensive coming. The mud is drying. The fighting season is opening. It's going to be really, really rough again. The Ukrainian strike, this drone strike, is an amazing operation designed both to relieve the onslaught against their cities and towns by the long-range bombers, but also to tell the world we can still defend ourselves. The last point you make, I think, is one of the most interesting, Andrew, and that's whether Trump walks away. And then the question is, if he walks away, does he walk away, wash his hands of the entire thing and completely pull American support, which is a huge blow to Ukraine, or does he just quit the negotiations? That would be far less serious for Ukraine.
Well, that does seem to me to be the choice for Mr. Trump. He can accept that he's not getting anywhere with Mr. Putin, who wants too much. It would be a Carthaginian peace to agree to that. And he can double down on support for Ukraine, maybe even tighten sanctions too. Yeah. Or he could just walk away and leave them to it, which J.D. Vance mutters every now and then. That's what he would really like to do. And I suppose, Tim, at the moment, nobody in Washington can tell us which way he's going to go.
That's right, and there's a split in the Trump administration because Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, would prefer, he's a sort of traditional, almost Atlanticist Republican. He would probably prefer to keep the assistance going. So look at the scenarios. If Trump walks away completely and pulls assistance, at that point, the Ukrainians lose access to Starlink, the satellites, Musk satellite system. And when that was temporarily removed, they almost ground to a halt because this is the system that guides their guided missiles. Without it, they're in serious trouble. They would also lose the Patriot air defense system and so be even more vulnerable to the Russians. They would lose the intelligence that the Americans give them, and they would also run out of weapons because the Europeans can't supply what the Americans are. So that would be massive. If he just walks away from negotiations but keeps the help up, yeah, that's different. You mentioned sanctions. There is something coming down the pipeline, and I can't quite get a handle on it. You probably know about the Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal. This, for people that don't follow it, there's a bill that is pretty soon going to come up to Congress. It has to go through Senate and the House, and then it has to be approved by Trump. So it says anyone, if it passes and is approved, anyone that buys energy from Russia will have tariffs of 50% imposed upon almost all of their goods.
Yes.
The problem I have with this is that means that, well, the UK still buys some energy. Most of Europe still buys some energy. But so does India, and so does China. So in the middle of these delicate negotiations, is Trump really going to slap these 500%? Which brings me to the last point. If it passes, Trump at least then has this document which he can wave at Putin and say, if you don't get serious, I'll sign it. Now, he might be bluffing, but yes, okay, to return to your very first point, at the moment, at best, the negotiations are sort of in a holding pattern because they certainly haven't gone forward.
Suppose that Trump doesn't entirely turn his back on Ukraine and that there are still some supplies, intelligence, satellite, military hardware getting into Ukraine from America. If that was the situation, and there is a major summer offensive from the Russian forces, do we have any idea what's likely to happen? Would the Ukrainian lines largely hold?
There are several schools of thought. There's two schools of thought, which is the first, that they will hold. Because the Ukrainian, I mean, this is one of the things you obviously covered the Strategic Defence Review yesterday, and what the British have realised, and many other militaries, is that do not fight the previous war, fight the next war, the modern war, which is about drones. Any military that does not now massively invest in drones will lose whatever war it fights. So the Ukrainians have almost pioneered this on a mass level. It was actually the Azerbaijanis that showed the world a few years ago this was the new warfare, but they've taken it to another level. And it is the drones that are causing the most damage to the Russians. So I actually buy the school of thought that although there will be incremental, slow gains for the Russians in the offensive, the line can hold if the Ukrainians are still supported. The other school of thought, Andrew, the two big ones, looks at longevity and attrition, and looks at the fact that the Russian armaments factories are printing, building, making more missiles than the European defence industry, defence missiles can produce. And more importantly, the meat grinder, the population is 5 times larger. And over a period of time, whether it's a year or 3 years, that grinds the Ukrainians down to the point where there's some sort of collapse because they simply can't hold the lines. They don't have enough people. So, obviously we don't know, but those are the two big schools of thought. I certainly think that if the Americans were to pull everything, then at that point, the second school of thought trumps the first.
You mentioned our Strategic Defence Review, and a revanchist Russia has been, it seems, the single biggest influence on this Strategic Defence Review. Two things puzzle me. Let me try and do both of them quickly. Start with the first. The Prime Minister says he's putting us on a war footing. How do you do that in this decade, what's left of it, by adding a mere 0.2% of GDP to defence spending?
You don't.
Well, you've answered that. Okay. Let me come to the second one. If the threat is now imminent, why is so much emphasis on kit and hardware that won't be deployed, won't be ready, won't be available for at least a decade or more?
Yeah, it is a problem. I mean, I've got some sympathy with the government on the second point because, it does take time to gear up, to reopen and unmothball or build the new factories that are going to be required. And they are looking at a minimum of 5 years. And I think that's how long we've got. I think the Russians will have regenerated within about 5 years. But all this 3 to 3.5% is becoming very real. And I thought, forgive me for blowing smoke up the Times, but the Times front page this morning has got it spot on. It said something along the lines of tax rises loom because of the SDR. You cannot have what the SDR recommends unless you raise taxes. And that is an argument that is coming to a head. And
we had Jack Straw on this programme yesterday saying exactly that. Just a final question. When you look now at what other NATO allies are doing, and we know so many of them have been laggards, and the Americans are quite right to have said Europe needs to do more. But when you look at what they're doing now, Finland, Poland, Sweden, Germany, the UK, I would suggest, Tim, risks becoming something of a laggard.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because for years we've actually been ahead of the game, but then we've kind of stalled. The Germans did something very, very interesting this month. They have officially deployed the beginnings of a 5,000 strong armoured brigade in Lithuania. This is out with NATO. That's the point I'm making about, making statements.
This is a German. This is not. I thought it was NATO. I did not know that.
No, as far as I understand it, it's out with the NATO alliance. I mean, obviously they are a member of NATO, but this is their own permanent deployment.
4,000.
It's the first time German troops outside NATO have been permanently deployed outside of its own borders since World War II. So that's the sort of thing that's happening. And you mentioned the Baltics. some of the East Europeans, the Nordics, and it's to do with geographic proximity.
Sure.
And yes, Britain has this big decision to make. We always talk about France and Britain being the two leading military powers in Europe. I think that risks changing, unless you think that's a good thing, and it could become France, Poland, and possibly Germany, with Britain below that. Now,
we shall see. Tim, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt. Great to talk to you as always. That's Tim Marshall.